Hey, we are live now. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. My name is Andrea Rojas, and I'd like to welcome you to our Ask Me Anything event. We are so excited to welcome you to this informal chat and Q&A discussion about your spring garden with our landscape architects, Jamie Feinstein and Gloria Sparrow. I'll be the facilitator for our session this evening. And for those of you who don't know us, Princeton Hydro is a small business consulting firm committed to improving our ecosystem's quality of life and communities for the better. We provide integrated ecological engineering services with expertise in natural and aquatic resource management, water resources engineering, geosciences, and regulatory compliance. Tonight, our experts will give a short presentation on how to plan for your spring garden and other tips and resources. To ask/submit a question, please type in the comments of the live video stream and we will answer them in order of when they come in. If you have any technical questions/issues during this event, please feel free to directly message the Princeton Hydro Facebook page and we will try our best to assist you. Additionally, this live will be available on our Facebook page and website if you would like to revisit it at a later time. And to introduce our experts of the evening, Jamie is a project manager and registered landscape architect with 15 years of experience. She incorporates a design-forward approach that is rooted in science, stewardship, cooperation, and sustainability. Jamie is responsible for the design of restoration and management solutions for multiple ecosystem types and in a variety of landscapes. She takes great joy in providing planting and grading strategies that enhance the experimental quality of projects, and she's an avid plant of lovers too. Our next expert is Corey. He is a professional landscape architect with 10 years of experience in the field. Corey is responsible for the creation of site layout designs, grading, renderings, graphics, planting lists, and plans, and construction documents associated with various aspects of ecosystem restoration and stormwater management. He is a wizard when it comes to graphic design and creates awesome site renderings in both photo and video format. Now that I've introduced our experts, they will now begin their presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So it's a short amount of time and there's so much to do in the garden. So I'll just get right into it. Spring to me is like a big time of waiting and looking out the window and kind of like going, what's happening? Is anything happening? And things are definitely happening. Sometimes they're happening below ground where we don't see them. And so it's a good time, like the winter and the early spring are a good time to plan. And then early spring, you should be finishing your planning and kind of getting out the tools. And so hopefully if you have already done some thinking and asked yourself or your landscape professional, what is it that you actually want to do in your space? And maybe, your space is your backyard and maybe the space is a community garden, or maybe it's just kind of volunteering in a nearby woodland nature center, wildflower reserve, your space is whatever you make it or whatever it is. I guess just sort of thinking about what you want to do there or what kind of events happen there if it's not your exact space. Like smaller urban backyard areas, it's really helpful to consider what's happening. Are you going to be hosting like 20 summer barbecues with like toddlers and dogs? Or are you really only interested in kind of like sitting and reading and growing herbs for your garden? Is it a place where it's important habitat for wildlife? I mean, I'm just going to say that all places are important habitats for wildlife of some sort, whether it be frogs or insects or mammals of some sort. So really think about that and what those activities entail. Are you, if it's your house, are you planning a big change? Like, are you going to do an addition? Are you still going to need access to those spaces for wheelbarrows or making a new path, or just how are you going to get there? How are you going to get all your materials that you need? there. Say you're planning on building raised beds, you're going to have to carry that lumber or those materials in somewhere. So, make sure that you give yourself space in your garden for yourself as well, and any help that you might be getting from others. And so I guess, my kind of bottom line is like always to keep in mind that gardens mean different things to different people. Like, a garden can have a community feel like this picture on, I guess, everybody's left. It has spaces for playing games, for picnicking, an open lawn area for running, raised beds, performance, space for dancing, playing dominoes. That can be something you need to prepare for the spring. It can be a woodland garden where you're really focusing on like ornamentals and native plants and natural habitat, or it can be your puppy's playground and they're just going to dig up everything all the time. So, that's a thing too. Next, I think Corey's going to take it away with talking about what makes up the physical characteristics of a site, your garden.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So the way that I sort of thought about this prompt of preparing your garden for spring, I was thinking about it if I was starting from scratch, and I sort of approached it the same way that we approach our projects here at Princeton Hydro, where the physical characteristics of the site sort of govern the optimum layout of species and composition that can be planted there. And some of those, most important types are soil, water, climate, and the plant hardiness zone. And so when we're talking about soils, we're talking about, the size of the particles, that are like, it's weathered bedrock and organic material, all in various stages of decay, with space in between that contain gas and or water. And they vary in size of particles. Sand is, considered to be a pretty big particle, and clay is really fine. And then we think about, the water on the site. Different plant species require, different quantities of water and soil moisture. And the amount of water available to the plants depends on, the weather, the overall climate of the region, the soil type again, and then the drainage of your site. And then when we talk about climate, we're talking about temperature ranges in planting zones, which you can see in the bottom right picture for the northeastern US. Most of our viewers are probably in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, so we're pretty firmly in the 7 and 6 category. And then there are various subcategories underneath that. And with climate change, this will probably shift so that as the eastern shore gets a little bit warmer, we start getting into like 5s and 6 instead of 7s and 6. And then, we're also talking about with climate, northern and eastern exposures, tend to be colder and have some different soil structures than warmer southern and western exposures. And then we also have to think about whether we're, in a valley or up on top of the hill, where winter and winds can be super impactful. And so those are just some of the first things that we start to consider when we're looking at, what are the really large physical characteristics of my property. Next slide. And so then we start, deciding, well, what plants, based on those characteristics, what plants do we want to use? And we could probably go on for way longer than an hour talking about specifics, plants and where they should go. But we wanted to keep this kind of general and just promote the use of native plants just throughout. Regardless of what you're trying to accomplish, please use native plants. Because when we use them, we're integrating our human environment with the natural landscape of the region. Native species thrive because they are acclimated to our region, and they can help build up the soils and purify the air and clean and recharge groundwater, and it helps provide food and habitat for native animals. Unfortunately, a lot of the garden centers and Lowe's and Home Depots of the world are still pushing, non-natives, specifically because they have a really predictable ornamental beauty. Every year, when it's going to flower, how long it's going to flower, and you can sort of count on that. Really, really dependable. However, there's really no consideration in those recommendations given to the fitness of that plant to the local ecosystem. Non-natives can pose a risk of becoming invasive, meaning they have the ability to invade and colonize the woodland, the pristine woodland that might be behind your property, or even if a bird picks up a seed and carries it to a pristine woodland 10 miles away, that non-native plant is having a really broad impact on the larger surrounding area. Then when we're planning for native plants in our landscapes and gardens, it really is a form of ecological design, which is, what Jamie and I do all the time here at Princeton Hydro. It allows us to recreate habitats that reflect our place in the natural systems of our region, and we really get to celebrate the diversity and beauty of plants that occur here naturally. Next slide.
Sorry, guys, my whole system just froze. Are we still on this slide?
No, next one, please.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm back.
And so we also wanted to talk about, design and a brief introduction into design. Plants come in every possible shape, size, and color you can imagine. So we just wanted to talk about a few of the basics to consider when you're looking to spruce up your garden this spring. So colors are typically described in two categories as either cool or warm. You have your greens and blues are typically the cool colors, while red, orange, and yellow are your warmer colors. And then you also want to think about pairing colors together that complement each other. So you have red and green is a good combination, blue and orange is a good combination, and then yellow and purple. And then there are also white flowering species, and those can really be placed anywhere, but they're most effective when grouped in front of foliage that's really dark. And then sort of in the intro to design, they'll talk about all of these color schemes, and there's 6 classifications. I won't go through all 6. I'll just do these 3 listed here, and it's really about designing or coming up with a theme for the color palette essentially of your garden, and it can help take a list that might be 20 species long and narrow it down to 5 or 6. And so when I'm talking about these color schemes, one is monochromatic, which means one color is associated with the tints and shades, and then we have complementary schemes where it uses colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So an example would be purple and yellow, and that's best to implement. This scheme is best implemented when one color is more dominant than the other rather than equal. And then we have a primary color scheme, which uses the 3 primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. And that can result in an energetic feeling. It'll attract attention and stimulate the brain. But it's also important to sort of pump the brakes sometimes, because if you overdo it, it can become visually jarring. Jamie, did you want to talk about the bloom seasons?
Sure. So as you can see from these snapshots, which are all moments in time, a garden can look a certain way during one month and, really different than in the next couple of weeks. I think one thing that, COVID sort of gave me was really a lot of time to watch what was going on week to week and see what weeds were coming up and how things were looking. And so, you can get really dorky about these things and kind of make a chart or an Excel spreadsheet, or, move pieces of paper around on a table and think about all your plant selections and think what's going to bloom early, what's going to bloom. So like in April, early April to the end of April, what's going to be coming up in June, what's going to be coming up in July. And, think about your areas in terms of when you're seeing them, how you're using them, what experiences those areas will provoke. And, kind of just making sure, or not making sure, I don't know, there's all this pressure to be like the perfect gardener. You don't have to be the perfect gardener. There's no like wrong way to garden, but just sort of thinking about ways in which you can really change the experience throughout the season, with what's available, and how at one point the flowers might be the ornamental piece of something, and then those might die back and you can have really beautiful like seed heads or leaves. So there's multiple parts to plants that can be attractive. And this, I think, also leads into textures and structure, which I've just sort of like broken down to height here. But thinking about things as like fine versus coarse. Hosta is hopefully a plant, we're all familiar with. It's maybe not native, but, it's got this big leaf. It's very visible from far away. So we would say that that's like a coarse texture, and then something finer, more like a grass, these little tufts of grass that are in this upper picture here. We could think of that as like a fine texture, and how those two things would look together, and how, grouping those plants together can kind of give you an area of a coarse texture or an area of a fine texture. And how those contrast similarly with the colors, can work, or can kind of be jarring, or depends what you really want to go for. And then I would say, seasonality, again, like those textures will become something in the winter, whether it's the soft leaf tissue dying back to the ground, and that's just like a void of space, or, you have these really persistent woody structures that can catch light and catch snow and catch wind, and have all of these other kind of visual and even auditory effects in different seasons, other than just like color. Sometimes things can get a little monochromatic, like the lower picture where you've got all these kind of browns and silver, not silver, the other one, orangey colors, wheatish colors, and that can be really beautiful as well. And then just kind of thinking also about heights. Some things can get really tall, and they'll need support, and they might flop over, and that's fine. Or maybe you don't want the tall things in front. You want tall things kind of further back, so you can layer with smaller plants in front, giving a really nice like sense of depth in your space. And if you mess it up, you can always dig it up and move it another time, so it's fine. Let's see, what else do we have here? Yeah, again, just going back to what I said about like observing what's happening. I think of the garden as just like a time exercise. Every year I learn something new, and then next year I forget that thing and I learn another thing. So it's sometimes fun to just keep notes or draw little sketches to see what you've learned, or maybe, a tree you planted 3 years ago is really grown in, and so you don't have the same sunshade pattern that you did before. So just kind of keeping, however you like to keep information in your mind, through photos or sketching, just, taking note of those things, and seeing where you can make, changes, because that's the other thing, is garden's always changing. So there's never not an opportunity to do something else. If you are into technological gadgets, there's a couple of apps out there. I haven't tried the first one, Sun Surveyor, but I think that the picture on the right is from Sunseeker, and some of them have a really interesting like augmented reality function where you actually kind of take pictures or video of your space and it overlays this kind of information. It can also overlay like actual shadows, depending on time of day you're projecting into, and really help you see kind of what some of those pockets of opportunity for planting or moving other plants around would be. There's no app for drainage conditions as far as I know, but you have your eyes and you'll see where the puddles are and where water is staying. And you know what that means for you if you're going to try to change that condition, or pick plants that are going to be appropriate to that condition. So something where you're noticing water staying for a couple of hours, or more than a couple of hours after a rainstorm, maybe that's a good place to plant some plants that are going to like that. I think Descampsia as nice grass that will like that. I've got some of that in my yard, taking up water where I'm wishing it wasn't, but I can't do anything about it right now. And then just invasive plants, pests, noting when different weeds appear, when you kind of need to get on top of them, or will they just kind of like, they have like a quick stint and then they go away and they're not really a problem. And then soil testing. I mean, that is a big observation, which, you need outside help for. And I guess it really depends what you want to do. There's all different kinds of soil testing. There's testing for contaminants if you want to grow food. There's testing for the physical makeup of soil to see what kind of soil you have, which will also indicate what type of drainage you will have, what kind of nutrients are available for plants, which will tell you what might thrive there, whether you need to add more organic matter. So it's really just an indicator. It's definitely not a death sentence or you can only do this sentence. But you'll have more success if you pick plants that are kind of in line with what your soil is saying will work there. What else is, do we have another slide here? Oh, yes. Okay. So now that we've considered all of these things, how do you start? So I know there's like a lot of kind of talk, like garden centers get really into like, it's time to get the garden ready for spring. You got to do this, you got to do this, you got to that. And I just say, wait, like you can just wait a little bit longer. Cutting back and pruning too early will really take down habitat and food sources for early season pollinators. So hopefully you've left, some leaf litter in your garden and you haven't cut everything back to the ground in the fall. And so leaving those seed heads and other plant parts on until the temperatures are consistently above consistently above 50 will really help give those those beneficial creatures a head start. They might give some non-beneficial creatures a head start too, but that's not up to you. So you did the best you could. If you're really like a glutton for punishment / exciting things, you can start seeds indoors early. And this is kind of like my second year doing it. And we've gotten really serious this year. We got grow lights and shelves and the whole heat mats and everything. So when you get your seed packets, depending on what you want to grow, I mean, some things you kind of have to start for seed or they won't have enough time to mature in our climate. So you get these seed packets, they all have, some version of instructions on the back. Some are okay to start outside when the frost is over. Some you need to start inside. They all have different depths you want to plant them at, and thinning and spacing. And so I'm being kind of like ridiculous this year where I just planted a bunch of seeds, but I haven't built my beds yet. And I mean, if I were a better person, I would have done that. But I can only do so much. So I mean, another thing to do is prepare your beds. Soil is the structure of everything. And whatever bed you are working on, whether it's a raised bed or a bed in the ground, the soil's pretty workable right now. We didn't have a very intense winter, so there really wasn't too much of a deep freeze. So there is plenty of time right now to get your compost soil amendments, bring in soil if you need to, and really start to build the area you want to work in or amend areas that are existing. And of course, in our area, we have lots of little creatures that also want to eat the things that we're growing, and you kind of have to protect your stuff from them, or just like have a really big garden or plant a decoy garden. I don't know. So, you know, groundhogs, rabbits, deer, all of those guys, little squirrels that like to dig stuff up. Think about ways in which you can protect your investment in the earth from being eaten by others other than yourself. So, you know, if you're on a big property and you have deer, that's going to mean a significantly taller fence than if you're in a smaller yard where you just have like rabbits and fox and animals that like to dig. So you've got the up and you've got the down, and both of those things need to be part of your considerations. So I think I've blathered on enough about that and all of my garden anxiety, but you shouldn't have any garden anxiety. So Corey can talk to you now about installation and design.
Yeah, so if you've followed everything that Jamie and I have said to this point, you have your plant selected, you know what you want to plant and where. And so we just wanted to provide you with some installation tips and tricks. Clustering has really great impact when you're putting plants into the ground, as you can see from the image in the top right. You want to plant in groups of at least 3 to 5. More, I feel, is always better. You can get these like really big drifts. You can see in the middle there, the purple coneflower. And then I think in the back there is probably like a boneset or something like that with maybe switchgrass in the front. And it just creates this like really, bucolic, rolling hill-esque like landscape of different plant heights. And then you want to plant in the growing seasons, spring and fall, those are the primary ones. Spring, typically April, May, June. And then your fall is really October, November. You want to avoid planting during the really hot months of the year, unless you're able to get out there and water them pretty much every day if they need it. Or in the event of a drought and we're not getting a whole lot of rain. Spring, I typically like to wait until after Mother's Day to start planting. I think by that time in the year, you're really just, you've pretty much assured yourself that you're going to be outside any frost windows. And then with the spring, it's been funny over the past few years of working with Princeton Hydro, we've been able to plant later and later into November and sometimes even early December if we have a really mild winter. So again, as weather patterns change and the climate gets a little bit warmer, these windows sort of go with the trends of that year. And so, sometimes I rely a little bit more on my experience than, just, what a book or a website might say. But when it comes time to put your plants in the ground, when you take it out of the container, make sure that you're planting it at the same depth as the container itself. The top of that, the top of the soil in the container should be level with the ground that you're putting it into. And then you gently want to remove the plants from the container by turning the container over like upside down, and then tapping on the sides to avoid, losing that that soil mass that's there. And then in this bottom left picture, you'll see, and you've probably experienced this before if you're, an avid gardener, is that these container materials will often have the roots super compact and wrapped around themselves. And so to sort of help stimulate that root growth once it's in the ground, you really want to start gently loosening them, with your gardening gloves, sort of just like, rubbing around the side, giving it a nice little massage, or using the side of your trowel to, cut the little ends a little bit. And then, once the it's ready to go in the ground, put it right in the center of the planting hole, and be careful as you're backfilling the hole with the soil, that it's free from like really large clumps. Planting in, it sort of depends, it goes back to like what type of soil you have. If you have like this really dry soil, it's going to be super easy to like break up and get these really large or really small particles. Whereas if you're in like a more wet scenario, that soil can become like super cloggy and dense and really hard to break up and keep small. So like the next part of that is like, once the plant is in the ground and you've backfilled, put the backfill in, you really want to press firmly around the edges. And the point of that is to eliminate any air pockets that might have formed while you were planting your containerized or bare root plant. If you get like really large pockets, could be occupied by air, can also be occupied by water, and then you get rot and your plant sort of just rots from the bottom up. So you also want to water it thoroughly once it's in, and it should be repeated as needed to prevent the soils around the root from drying out. And then if it's part of your aesthetic, add the mulch color that you want. I always go no mulch in my gardens. I just think it looks better. It's also less time consuming for me. I don't have to spend an afternoon spreading mulch all day. But there are benefits to it. It helps retain moisture. It can help keep the competitive weeds down, so you're not spending as much time weeding. But if you are going to use mulch, make sure you keep it thin. You want to keep the mulch several inches away from the main stem of whatever you're planting around. But also you don't want to mound the mulch like you would see in like the parking lot of your local grocery store. That's really, really a bad technique. And those landscapers are definitely using way too much mulch. But mulch can also mean a lot of different things. It can be your grass clippings from the previous year, or shredded or rotted leaves. In the fall, I always just compost my leaves right into my lawn, instead of spending the time raking them up and putting them on the curb. It's free nutrients for the soil around your house. Or you can bag them and compost them and put that in your garden for the next year. I also did that a lot. And then, just be careful if a lot of people end up taking pine trees down around their house, and pine needles. If you get too much of it in the soil, it can make the soil acidic, and impact the growth of your plants in that way.
Are you good, Corey?
Yeah, I'm good. Go ahead. Sorry.
I would just add to your mulching. I've been doing sheet mulching this year, which is interesting because we had a lot of grass that we didn't want anymore, and we're also kind of lazy, so we took big sheets of cardboard and actually an old rug that someone gave to us that our dog peed on, and just laid it out in the backyard over that grass and put dried leaves on top of it as a way, and overwintered it just as a way to get that sod underneath, or that grass matting to die off. And then we'll pick it up in the spring and work that soil. So if you have big areas of grass, or just weeds or something else that you want to sort of take care of in a fell swoop, that's a good way to go about it. So I guess in terms of other types of planting to experiment with, if you, like me, are led by your stomach, it's really fun to play around with native edibles. I guess it's easy to think of fruit like bananas and oranges and things that don't grow here, and get really like, why did I move to some place where that grows? But there's some great fruits and nuts too that I didn't mention here, but like currants, elderberry, and American persimmons, pawpaws, which are the bottom right, blueberries, woodland strawberries, all kinds, hazelnuts, all kinds of really fun stuff to play around with. And there are definitely some native growers who are supplying small species of these around. If you're interested in resources, I'm sure we could definitely point you in the right direction. So yeah, it's pretty fun to play around with that and make jam and, you know, just kind of do something a little bit different in terms of the, you know, annual agriculture that is prevalent. You know, we can have these like perennial polycultures going on that will, you know, last for years. Okay, look, this is, I believe, our last slide or close to our last slide. So I guess we just wanted to talk a little bit about resources for folks that want more information on specific things. Obviously, your state extension, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, those are great resources. Many have native plant resources, pest resources, resources about edibles, just pretty much anything you can think of. They have a resource, green infrastructure, making a rain garden as part of your backyard or front yard or wherever. The Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has lots of information, definitely a lot of information about urban conditions as well. Free Haven Educational Farms, they're a great organization that I just came across recently based in Trenton, giving often free agricultural education for people that are starting gardens, you know, in their communities or just even, you know, in their yards, talking about soils and soil testing and just really kind of going step by step in how to get started. Obviously, prices of food are impacting many people, inflation, even scarcity of, you know, certain items. So I really like their bent on, you know, don't complain, prepare. So, you know, get prepared, grow some food. And then obviously the USDA has a great plants database that tells you everything you could possibly want to know about native plants in the US, where they're found regionally, have they escaped, have non-native plants escaped and become wild? It's just a wealth of information in so many different formats. I really find it quite overwhelming sometimes, but very useful. Corey, did you want to add anything or say anything about any of these resources?
Yeah, so USDA Plants is a site that I use all the time, and I'm really just using it to verify that the plant that in my mind I think you know, will work in a certain area will actually or is native to that location, and so USDA has an online database where it will show you to the county whether or not it's native to your area. But if let's say it's in your neighboring county and not showed on yours, you're probably okay to plant it. Just don't plant anything from Florida or California, and you should be all right. And then there's always there's like native wholesale nurseries like Pinelands in New Jersey, which is one of our primary suppliers. They don't sell to homeowners, but if you're looking to get a good idea of, you know, what's out there and being grown, I would suggest using their website. You can sort by bloom time, you can sort by, you know, water requirements, height requirements, pretty much anything you can imagine. And it'll spit out a list of, you know, plants that they grow that will work for the design or scenario you're trying to accommodate. There's the local conservancies in your area. Those are always a good resource as well.
Nice.
And yeah, so that wraps up our presentation portion. So if you have anything landscape architecture, design related, or if you already have a garden and you want to ask us something about, being landscape architects at Princeton Hydro, we'd be happy to take those questions.
And before I ask you some audience questions, I've seen some new people join halfway through the presentation, and I want to reiterate that this presentation will be available after the live ends on our Facebook and on our website at a later date. And I actually do have a question from the audience to you from Chastity. They asked, we live in Highland Lakes. We would love to know the best way to test our soil since all parts of our mountain are very different from one another. It's a two-parter. The second part of the question is also, will make a property not a good candidate for a rain garden?
I can talk about soil testing. I assume Highland Lakes is in New Jersey. Well, even if it's not, it doesn't really matter. But Rutgers University, their extension office has a great soil testing program. You can go on their website and there are forms and there are different tests that you can select. I didn't quite hear all of the question. I think you were asking, you said the mountain has many different types of soil. Was that it, Andrea?
Yeah, they said all parts of our mountain have very different types of soils from one another.
Okay. So I would say, just make it easy for yourself. If you think if there's an area that you want to work in, you can take samples from that area, and the testing instructions from Rutgers will tell you how many to take and to what depth you need to go. I mean, the cows come home and it's really only based on what information you're trying to find out. So, I'd say start small and find out what you can find out about one area, and then go from there. And, I think if you're looking for more of an overview of the mountain area, then there's really great data on the USGS. They have soil surveys for the whole country, and they can get, down to kind of smaller areas. And that'll give you a more general idea of like geologically, kind of like what parent material is making up those soils that you have. So depending on how far you can kind of extrapolate that in your mind, if that's sort of more the direction you're looking to think about. There's also some really great books out there. I believe I'm gonna get the name wrong, but it's Plant Communities of New Jersey is one, and there's American Landscapes for American Gardens is another one that really talk about what kinds of plant communities are typical in relation to the geology of some of these areas in New Jersey. There's just been so many people working on this for so long that there's so much knowledge out there that can really help you kind of relate and actually start to really see landscapes in a new way. Like when you start to see, a certain mix of tree species, like you'll start to actually think like, oh, like, this kind of bedrock geology formation was happening here, and that's these soils are rather shallow and they're like this, they have this iron richness to them, and therefore these types of plants grow really well here. So it kind of like unravels this whole new interesting way of seeing things. So hopefully that answered the first part of your question, and then I don't know, Corey, do you want to take the rain garden part?
Yeah, just to reiterate what Jamie was saying, yeah, the Plant Communities of New Jersey book, you saw me duck off screen. I was trying to find mine so I could hold it up. It's somewhere here in my office. I'm not sure where though. But yeah, that'll give you like the type of forest, essentially down to like the primary species in terms of the canopy, and then the understory layer, and even down to the herbaceous layer, typical plants that you would see in those communities. And then, whether or not your property is suited for a rain garden, I would say it sort of I would base it off of that soil survey, the web soil survey that USGS has, that Jamie mentioned. being up in the Highland Lakes region, which is like way up north New Jersey. I'm going to say that, you know, if rain gardens can take all shapes, sizes, contents, you know, so if you're in a really shaded area, your rain garden is going to look very different than a rain garden that's going to be like sort of out in the open. So it sort of depends on the structure of your yard in general. And if you have, whether or not you have ponding issues. I mean, if you don't have any water infiltration issues at your property right now, then, you know, a rain garden probably isn't the best approach. But if you do have infiltration problems, you know, you are going to have to dig a little bit to find out what's underneath there, and what's causing those issues. And then, yeah, maybe a rain garden is the right solution for any issues that you have.
The Rutgers Cooperative Extension has a really great resource for rain gardens, kind of mostly residential type guidance of, you know, siting it and just kind of more information on everything Corey was mentioning. And they have a really nice slide presentation that walks you through sizing and what to look for in terms of infiltration.
Also, we did publish a blog on how to build a rain garden in 10 steps, written by our CEO, Jeff. If anybody wants to check that out, just wanted to plug that in. And then second, Chastity did post a follow-up, and they said that the Highland Lakes region does have 5 lakes, and the mountains can be very rocky. So we can be in the very rocky areas or very marshy, wet areas. They said, thank you. Hopefully they're able to test their soil with the resources you've given. Also, we will probably link these resources in our website at a later date. Thank you for your question, Chastity. And then my next question to you is, what is your favorite plant?
I guess it sort of depends on what type of plant we're talking about. If it's herbaceous, I'm a big fan.
Don't overthink it, Corey. Just pick
Yeah,
one.
just pick one. All right, tulip tree is my favorite. Tulip trees are my favorite.
God, I have so many favorite plants. Let's see, probably when I can eat. So I'm going to go with the alpine strawberry. It's just delicious and perennial.
Nice. Do I have one?
Of course you do. What is it?
I'm trying to think. I do have one. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure if they're natives, but I like marigolds. We usually buy them and keep them inside the house. We don't plant those outside. But I like a bright flower, personally. Okay, my next question to you is, what type of mulch is best to use? I've heard that the colored mulch is not great for the environment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I don't know that much about it, but I can imagine that the process by which they dye the mulch is probably quite noxious. You know, whether that dye and what it's made out of moves into the soil and your plants that's likely. And it's just, I guess, as far as general mulching, my school of thought, oh, I'm suddenly in the dark now because my timer on my seed trays just went off and the lights went on. So I'm really dedicated to this. My thoughts on mulch have always been that you should try to mulch with something that you are essentially trying to grow. If you are growing a woody, forested type, you know, landscape of trees and shrubs, then using kind of a hardwood mulch is appropriate because that will eventually break down, you know, similar to those materials breaking down and create the kind of soil, because mulch eventually will become part of the soil. So you should try to go like with like. If you're growing edible annual crops, you know, like cabbages and potatoes and peppers and everything, then it's good to use something that's a bit more organic, I guess. So, mulch is probably not the right, but like compost, when you add your compost, use compost from like garden, the compost that you've made from other vegetables and those kinds of scraps. But that's just one school of thought. So I don't know, Corey, you have other thoughts on that?
No, I agree. Like like I mentioned, I'm a advocate against mulch. So like you said, I typically just use scraps from the yard from the previous year. Leaf litter, lawn clippings, sticks, and stuff like that. And once it's had a chance to decompose over a year plus, that being said, you need a lot of lead time to get into that. But yeah, using essentially what you, like you said, Jamie, what you've produced on your property to just reincorporate back into it is your best path forward. But if you had to force my hand and pick something from a supplier, darker mulch is probably better. Something with that, looks dirtier is probably better rather than, red mulch.
Yeah, I think just from an energy perspective, there's an extra process involved there to like create dye, bring in dye, force dye into these pieces of wood. So, it's not carbon neutral, I'll say that.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. I don't do any of the mulching at my own home, but I will pass this information down. Let's see. So my next question to you is perennials versus annuals. What's better for the garden? And do you have any preference on that?
You want to go first, Jamie?
No,
No.
I just did that so you would think I did.
I mean, honestly, I don't do a lot of gardening. Not so much anymore. I'm in an apartment complex now. When I had my house, I did do a little bit of gardening, but I always stayed away from the annuals just because it seemed like more work. The perennials were always my favorite. I sort of just wanted to set it and forget it, type of thing. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but it comes down to personal preference, and what species are available that fit into those categories.
I think from a native plants perspective and a kind of cultivar or I'm trying to say basically from a biodiversity perspective, I think you're going to find a lot more variety with perennials, and I think you can be more selective about perennials that have not been kind of bred into wonder bread, if you will, where they're really produced for human eyes and not so much for their value to pollinators or other creatures. I mean, sometimes it's almost as if these creatures can't recognize these plants anymore. So I think annuals, tend to be bred more along the line of being really showy and can just be like overbred from a biodiversity kind of ecological value standpoint. But obviously annuals have their value in terms of beauty and other things too. I used to work in Flushing Meadows Corona Park in New York, and every year when the USTA would come for the US Open, they would just go crazy planting annuals in this park. And I mean, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't beautiful, so yeah, I agree. It's just personal preference.
Interesting. That makes sense. Also, to circle back on the mulch question, because Jeff, our CEO, asked a question. He asked, What about biochar for mulch? What do you think about that?
I think implemented in the right way, it's probably useful. I think biochar probably is better used in a large scale effort to try and clean something up. So unless you're, unless the runoff coming from your yard is super saturated with the elements that biochar is good at removing, I would say it's probably not super worth the money to implement in your yard. But at the same time, I haven't really looked into, biochar as sort of a mulch application. Be interesting to look into that more. I don't know, Jamie, if you have experience with it.
Not as mulch. I thought it was pretty light, in weight, which is what I would worry about. But yeah, all the things you said, I agree with as well.
Thank you, Jeff, for your question and for joining us today. My next question to you is from Chris Mikolajczyk. Is there a source for native deer-resistant plants in New Jersey?
Yeah, I think the advertisement of any plant being deer resistance is a false one. Sure, there are some that are less palatable than others to deer. But generally, because, in the Northeast, we do have such an overpopulation of deer. Once they get through whatever they like eating, they're going to come for that deer resistant plant. Yeah, there's probably a few online resources that we can have Andrea put up after the post that could link you to a site that might classify some as being deer resistant.
I will do that. Thank you for your answer, and thank you, Chris, for your question. Let's see. So we're about to hit our 60-minute mark. So I'll ask you one more question and then we can wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I guess my last question to you is, what do you do if your plants get aphids?
I have a small panic attack, and then I have my husband spray them with a spray that smells like cloves and hot garbage, but it is apparently organic. That's my personal thing, but I know there are other ways to combat that. There's a lot of hand smushing. It depends how bad your infestation is. I mean, there's other beneficial insects that eat aphids, such as ladybugs, that you can actually purchase and release into your garden, or kind of like encourage them by planting plants that they like. I have also found that Nicotiana is a plant that's related to tobacco, is kind of like a decoy. They love it. So if you're willing to kind of plant it and let them eat that, or interplant, companion planting. I'm trying to say companion planting, that, planting plants that aphids kind of like and don't like, or that attract their predators, will help with that. And there are also a variety of sprays that are, I think they have either neem or tea tree or clove oil in them. Those are some of the biological oils that help control those. You do have to be careful when you're spraying them, because any oil that is exposed to strong sunlight has the potential to burn the plant. So always read your labels. Aphids are really annoying because they will suck out the life of your plant through the new growth. So they can be quite detrimental, but I think it's also worth, examining your yard and seeing what you've got, what else they're on, if they're, do you have kind of a condition where your plant is stressed? Because sometimes aphids will are more likely to attack a stressed plant. So there's kind of a multi-step approach. I don't know if you have any secret magic, Corey.
I have almost zero experience with aphids. So my suggestion was going to be the same as yours, buy some ladybugs and let them have at it.
And where can you find these ladybugs?
I don't know.
I don't know if you Google like beneficial insects or something like that. I'm sure some garden supply will pop up with that. I mean, they send chicks in the mail. It's totally crazy if you ask me. But oh, and one thing I did want to say is that this is not my usual screensaver background. There are frogs here, and I put this up because I wanted to remind everybody that spring and warmer nights in the spring are prime time for amphibians to start migrating to lay their eggs. So if you are driving on a warm night, please be careful, like go slow. And if you see little shiny eyes in the street, slow down, don't run them over. Just something to be mindful of during this time of year, because this is when they start to repopulate and mate and lay eggs and do all their reproductive stuff. So this is actually from an article in 2018 that was asking why frogs were disappearing. So, keep that in mind.
Thank you for that. I'll keep that in mind as well. Also, Jeff also said high pressure water also knocks the aphids off your plants if you want to do that. But also happy World Water Day, everybody. That's today. Also, that's all my questions for you. We're past the 60-minute mark. We're past 7 o'clock. Nicole says, great work, Jamie and Corey. Yay. So thank you for tuning into our Facebook Live event and for your questions. And thank you to our speakers for such an insightful presentation. Again, this live will be available on our Facebook page and website. If you're interested to learn more about our projects, please give us a follow on our social media pages. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. If you'd like to work with us on a project, you can reach out to us via our website contact form at princetonhydro.com. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, guys.